This is going to be a response to a user named Mojosideburns, who's an absolute nobody, but I was thinking I needed to make a video like this anyway, so I might as well do one now that I have an excuse to respond to this person. He starts off by saying, there's a very large percentage of the world that is racially ambiguous. Okay, yes, there's also some bodies of water that are ambiguous as to whether or not they should be labeled a lake or a pond. There are some geological formations that are not clearly either a hill or a mountain. Does this mean we should get rid of the terms hill or mountain or lake or pond? No, that's dumb. Also, if you mix colors together, you can get different colors. Therefore, red and green don't exist. Right? No, that's dumb. Okay, then he says, the races are not just black and white. There are many other races. Yeah, I never said that. Like that all of humanity could be called black and white. God damn it. However, most of the racial statistics do compare blacks and whites, and so that's why I talk about them the most. Then he says, the vast majority of people have traits from a different race or different races. And yeah, that's true. I don't know what this is supposed to mean. I have some traits of chimpanzees. I have 5 fingers and 5 toes. I have opposable thumbs. I have eyes. I have respiration. I have a nose. You know, I don't know what this is supposed to mean. We're talking about aggregate differences between, aggregate populations, and especially as it relates to politics and the politics of income inequality between the aggregates. And then he says, evolution happened, and the races differentiated by adapting to their specific environments. I guess trying to imply that there's no one is inherently superior or inferior, which is not something I've ever said. And I'm making that inference from a statement because he never said this. And yeah, right. Different populations adapted to different environments, and that's why they develop different brains. And this makes me think that this person, Mojosideburns, lacks a theory of mind, as though I would dispute something like this, or that I didn't know that the races, evolved in different environments. I don't. So yeah. Then he says race mixing has occurred throughout history, and yes, paint mixing has also occurred throughout history. Okay, I don't know what that means. Also, anti-race mixing laws have occurred throughout history. I can say things happen too. And he says, I come into contact with people of all races all the time, And that's cool, so do I. I live in Los Angeles, in the greater Los Angeles area. It's a pretty big area, so it's not like you know where I live by saying I live in Los Angeles. In fact, back when I lived around a bunch of white people, before I moved to Los Angeles, I had a much more positive view of blacks and Hispanics than I did once I moved. I believe this is because of how blacks and Hispanics are portrayed in the media. That is, they tend to be portrayed as noble, as disadvantaged, as doing the best with what they got, right? And being unfairly profiled and discriminated against and stuff like that. My personal experience with hundreds of blacks and Hispanics has changed this view, or changed this view a while back, and that actually prompted me to look into this whole race thing. But don't take my word for it. It's actually become a bit of an embarrassment for the civil rights establishment that white kids in integrated schools have worse views on other races than white kids in all-white schools. That is, integration has increased negative racial views among whites. That is, in short, familiarity does breed contempt. The contact hypothesis has been proven wrong. At a bit of a tangent, sometimes what a lot of these people will do is they'll say, well, the contact hypothesis hasn't been proven wrong because there's been conflict in these schools. That is, what they'll say is that they'll say, well, contact reduces animosity between groups if it's in a non-confrontational environment. And what they're saying is that, well, in these integrated schools, there has been a lot of conflict between whites and blacks, therefore the contact hypothesis is not disproven because it's not, peaceful, harmonious contact. But of course, that you see how that's stupid, right? Like the idea is that if they come into contact, they will be peaceful and harmonious. Like that, like they kind of like they have to basically assume the very thing that they're trying to approve with the contact hypothesis. Basically, any reasonable person will see that the contact hypothesis failed, and that in terms of race, familiarity breeds contempt. Okay, then he says, culturally, white Americans have more in common with black Americans than African-born blacks. This is debatable and disputed by various people. I'm kind of agnostic on that, but it doesn't really matter because American blacks vote overwhelmingly for wealth redistribution schemes or systematic theft schemes. and they vote overwhelmingly for racial privileges for their race, and racial privileges in what? In government contracts, government jobs, you know, the diversity mandates on jobs, and affirmative action in schools. So, I mean, yeah, that's still problematic. You know, whether or not they're African, you know, whether or not they have quote unquote my culture is largely irrelevant, because there's really only about, you know, 100 people that I actually know and that I actually care about, and who I actually care about what they think, right? It's called the Dunbar unit. I would recommend look up Dunbar's number. So what the intrinsic culture of black Americans versus black Africans, it doesn't matter, because politically they're indistinguishable. And that's all that matters to me. He then says, there isn't a single gene that says black people will behave one way and white people will behave another way, but there is a complex interplay between nature and nurture. Oh, right, I never said anything else. Men tend to behave one way, women tend to behave another way, though culture can inflame or dampen these innate tendencies between the genders. Innate tendencies also exist between the races, meaning that given a similar environment, the different races will on aggregate behave differently. Then he says there's no way to quantify it, and I assume he means there's no way to quantify the genetic component of behavior, and this is stupid, right? What if I proclaim that women are innately less violent than men? Well, we can look at existing violent crime differences between men and women, but you could just say, well, that's because of culture, right? Look, boys are raised to play war games, and they're raised to watch violent TV shows, therefore it's cultural. You know, how could you quantifiably prove that men are innately more violent than women? You can't. Right? You can make inferences from facts and logical interpretations about those facts, but you can't prove it. Okay. Now, I use that example, you know, which is of something obvious, like the men being more violent than women, in order to set up this point. Blacks are as more violent than whites as men are more violent than women. Why should we assume that the higher black violence is a result of culture, while the higher male violence is a result of genetics? Now, perhaps culture inflames violent tendencies that populations already have, but, you know, you would have to show evidence of that. Okay, you would have to, you know, restrict access to violent media and violent friends of various people, and see how violent the behavior of these groups are in adulthood compared to some control group, right? You'd have to control the environment. Because it could just be that the violent media and culture is caused by the innately violent characteristics of the population in question, be it males or blacks, or especially black males. Okay, right? The causation could mostly go the other way. That is, it is the innate characteristics of, you know, blacks and males that cause the violent culture, and that the violent culture doesn't really have much of an effect on the behavior of blacks and males, right? And that's what I believe. So you would have to actually show something like that, but of course you can't. Right? Okay, then he says generalities don't apply to every individual, right? As if, yeah, I never said they did. You're making shit up about what I said. Then he says, if it doesn't apply to every individual in that group, it's essentially meaningless. Wow. One thing to look at, you're retarded for saying this is really dumb. Insurance companies, what they'll do is they'll take a look at like smokers. Smokers tend to, you know, be a little bit more unhealthy in some ways or another. They'll take a look at whether or not you're overweight. If you're overweight, you're more likely to get heart disease. Now, it's not true. Not every individual who's overweight does not get heart disease. Every individual who smokes does not get lung cancer. Okay, but because of the probabilities, the insurance companies are going to make you pay more because of those characteristics about you. Or let's take perhaps an even more obvious one. Let's say you're concerned about the safety of a nightclub, for example. Okay, you have limited resources as the owner of a nightclub. You can't keep an eye on every single person in the nightclub. Now, given that black males are about 50 times more likely than white females to commit a violent act, okay, because blacks are about 7 times more violent than whites, and males are about 7 times more violent than females, given that males are about 50 times more likely than white females to commit a violent act, who are you going to monitor? White females or black males? Okay, the answer is obvious. You're gonna profile the black males. That is the smart thing to do. That is the rational thing to do. More importantly, politics. Okay, there is racial income inequality between the races, and you know about this. Why is there this racial income inequality? Is it because of environment, or is it because of genetics, or is it a mixture of both? And to what degree are other races still responsible for correcting this inequality at this point in history? Now, pay attention right here. You need to listen here. When you control for average IQ score, the black-white income gap goes away, meaning that on average, a black person and a white person of a similar IQ earn similar incomes. Now, you can say the income inequality is a result of culture, discrimination, the effects of past discrimination, or some other environmental variable. You could say it's something like that. You can also say that the IQ gap is a result of bias in the test. However, it would be an incredible coincidence that both society and the IQ tests are precisely equally unfair to blacks. It is much more likely that neither society nor the IQ tests are unfair to blacks. And it's more likely that the current income inequality reflects real differences in real productivity. Okay, that's much more likely than these biases being precisely even. Okay, therefore, racial preferences to blacks are unjustified. You say I am for passing judgment on individuals based on group generalizations. Sort of. I'm for profiling, right? I'm for keeping an eye on black males as opposed to keeping an eye on white females. I mean, if that's what you mean, then yes. If you're talking about legal judgment or denying of economic opportunities based on group generalizations, no, that is not true. That is not only not true, it is the opposite of true. I am for eliminating legal privileges based on race, right? Legal privileges that treat each individual differently based on their race, which is also known as affirmative action. Then he says, I challenge you to prove that the standardized test scores are more a result of innate differences than environment. You can't do it. He keeps saying you can't do it. Well, yeah, you can. One thing we can look at twin studies. Identical twins reared apart have IQs that correlate more closely than fraternal or non-identical twins that are reared together. This is evidence that differences in genes are more important than the differences in environment within the U.S. overall. We can also look at the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. This is where they took some black, white, and mulatto children and placed them in white middle-class families. The study was funded by the Pioneer Fund, admittedly, but the study was actually run by Sandra Scar, who is an avowed racial creationist, or, behaviorist, egalitarian, whatever you want to call them, like you. In it was found that blacks scored at the bottom, mulattoes, half white, half black, scored in the middle, as you would expect from these genetic generalizations, and the whites scored at the top. The adopted whites scored above the blacks and mulattoes, obviously, but the non-adopted whites were actually at the tippy top. That is the white children who are in their biological parents. Now, I'm of the opinion that the non-adopted whites had higher IQs because of their genes, that their higher IQs over the adopted whites was actually a result of the genetic differences between the adopted whites and the non-adopted whites. But that's not really the important point of this study. The important point is talking about the differences between the adopted whites and the blacks and mulattoes. The next point is that mulattoes tend to be intermediate, right? Along with the intermediate mulatto score in the Minnesota Transracial, we can also look at the intermediate mulatto scores in South Africa, and I'm pretty sure I can find more. I know that there are a lot more stuff doing this, showing that mulattoes or mixed-race blacks tend to have much higher IQ scores than pure blacks. And historically, mulattoes have actually been treated worse than pure blacks because mulattoes are the products of race mixing, right? So if you want to go by historical oppression, mulattoes have been treated worse because race mixing is hated by racial nationalists. We can also look at gene amplification. Now, I'm sure that you've noticed that as you've gotten older, you look and act more like your parents, right? Also, when you're younger, you tend to have lighter features than when you get older. There's a lot of people who are blonde as kids, but then they get older, they have darker hair. For example, I'm kind of like that. This is because as you get older, genes will get expressed more. And so the dominant genes start to express more over the recessive genes, which tend to be of lighter features. Also, if you look at a chicken and a human's embryo, you'll see that they look very similar. Okay? It's not until further development that the human baby pulls away from the chicken baby. There was also a study done by Winthrop Kellogg where he raised his son Donald alongside a baby chimpanzee Gua. And the baby human and the baby chimp were actually quite evenly matched in a lot of these little intellectual tests that they were doing at a very young age. But of course we know that, and the test was canceled when Donald started mimicking the behavior of the chimp. And I think because the father was worried that Donald was going to start acting like a chimp or something, so he called off the study at that point. But we know, of course, that as development continues, humans become more intelligent than chimps, and humans begin to pull away from the chimpanzees, right? And this is an example of gene expression, genes becoming more important with age between species. We can also look at males and females. It's not until puberty that males become stronger than females. And finally, after illustrating this principle in obvious examples, is that racial differences in standardized test scores widen with age. Okay, young whites and young blacks have very similar test scores. At a very young age, whites and blacks in schools tend to be much more evenly matched than later on. So that's evidence of the differences being genetic, because as genes get more and more expressed through age, the racial IQ gap gets more expressed. Another example of this would be subtest heritability. Some portions of IQ tests are more heritable than others, which is to say the parental score and the child score correlate higher on some subtests than others. For example, math is one of the least heritable subtests and can be taught very easily. While pattern recognition, for example, is much more heritable. Pattern recognition really can't be taught as well, but math can be taught. So the inference is that pattern recognition is something more innate. It's something more in your genes, whereas math is more environmental, i.e. it can be taught. And we all know that some things can be taught and some things are more innate. Well, the racial gaps on the IQ tests are wider on the parts of the test that are more heritable, i.e. the subtests that are more innate. Okay, on the subtests which can be trained and the subtests which are more influenced by environment, the gap is smaller. Okay, this is evidence that genetic differences are the main cause of the racial IQ test gaps, not environmental differences. And then he says, you can't prove that because there's not an equal playing field because blacks and Latinos are trapped in poverty due to history. And you all know that spiel. And this is kind of funny. Because now this person is making two positive claims here. He first started off that said that I was making a positive claim without evidence. Now he's making two positive claims here. First, he's saying that the degree of poverty that exists in the U.S. has a significant impact on standardized test scores. I disagree, and I've shown some evidence that suggests this is not the case. But 6 pieces of evidence against this idea that the poverty that exists in the U.S. explains the differences in standardized test score. The evidence of this would be the twin studies, the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, the Milwaukee Voucher Study, the Abecedarian Project, intellectual self-assessment studies, and the Korean-Belgian Adoption Study. Now, we've already talked about the Minnesota Transracial Study and the twin study, so let's start off with the Milwaukee Voucher Study. The Milwaukee Voucher Study showed parity, essentially, between voucher schools and public schools. It showed that students who applied for vouchers and got them did no better than students who applied for vouchers and did not get them. This is evidence that the differences in quality of schools within the U.S. is not important, and that the schools don't produce good students, okay? What's actually happening is that good students tend to go to the same schools, creating the illusion that the school itself has something to do with the student quality when it really doesn't. Okay, then there's the Abecedarian Project. The Abecedarian Project was an extremely early intervention project. It was like Head Start on steroids. They took infants at 6 months, if I recall correctly, and what they had is they had basically professional educators working nonstop to raise these kids' IQs, and these kids were minorities. The idea was to get minorities in there, blacks and Hispanics. Now, what normally happens with these types of programs is that there are gains for these kids when they're very young, right? But these gains don't last later on in their lives, right? And that's what happened with the Abecedarian Project. Now, the Abecedarian Project was quite an extensive intervention. I mean, these are professional educators dealing with these kids like I'd have to go read over the study again, but it was like 4 hours a day when they were really little kids, doing all of these, like every trick in the book to try to like teach kids concept, teach kids like pattern formation, and trying to raise their general intelligence really. And but anyway, what happened? It's kind of like learning to tie your shoes when you're really young. Let's say you learn how to tie your shoes before everyone else does. Okay, does this mean that you will then learn calculus better than everyone else later on? No. And that's what kind of happens with these early intervention programs, right? They teach these kids things, and so these kids are actually ahead of everyone else in the class in terms of what they know, because they know the alphabet before everyone else. They know the names of shapes before everyone else. But learning these things, it doesn't increase your base level intelligence, okay? It doesn't increase your innate ability, okay, which is what IQ is designed to measure. It increases your knowledge, but it doesn't increase, for lack of a better term, the engine, the horsepower, the intellectual horsepower. It just increases what you already know. Okay, there was, okay, and the Abecedarian Project, like a lot of people talk about how white families show how the educational environment around white families, white parents teaching their kids things, is a cause of white students doing better in school and white kids having higher IQs later on in life. The Abecedarian Project puts the lie to that, right? Because they had these professional educators doing far more than the average white parent does, and the Abecedarian Project ended up having almost zero impact. In fact, there was a quote from someone who worked on the Abecedarian Project that showed that the IQ, that the best determinant for IQ of the students in the Abecedarian Project was the parental IQ. And it had very little to do with whether or not they were involved in the Abecedarian Project or whether or not they were in the control group. There was also a study that followed malnourished North Korean babies into Belgium. That there were these babies in North Korea and they were malnourished, and then they were sent to Belgium, and so they're malnourished at babyhood. So there's an argument that white parents give their babies better nutrition than black and Hispanic parents, and black and Hispanic parents have more formula or use formula more often, and so their babies don't have the same nutrition. And this study kind of puts the lie to that, because as it turns out, these malnourished babies, once they were fed a proper diet in Belgium, they quickly caught up to and outperformed the white Belgian population. In fact, they performed at the North Asian average, the global average IQ of North Asians, which is about 106 compared to white Europeans, which is about 100. Okay, and so they were slightly above the white European average, despite for the first, for some of these, it was like the first 3 years of their lives they were malnourished, but they quickly caught up. Right? It's as though they had the genetic code, the DNA, in their brain to say, this is the kind of brain you're going to have, but I don't have the resources now. But as soon as the resources were provided, the genes started to get expressed. Okay. So nutrition was not. It kind of puts the lie to the nutrition arguments. Another thing to look at is that blacks also have a higher self-esteem than whites, but more importantly, they also have a higher intellectual self-assessment, as they view themselves as more intelligent than white people view themselves. So even if you could show that stereotype threat, for example, does have a negative effect when present, I disagree with that, but even if that was true, the fact is that stereotype threat has not been internalized by blacks, according to these intellectual self-assessment surveys. Then you may want to say that the IQ tests are biased. No, they are not. I'll just link to an article talking about IQ test bias. Basically, IQ tests, the predictive validity of IQ tests is the same for blacks as it is for whites. Blacks do just as well on supposedly culture fair IQ tests than cultural. Actually, no, that's not true. Blacks actually do better on the supposedly culture biased IQ tests than on the culture fair tests, and blacks actually do better on the verbal portion of the IQ tests than on the nonverbal portion, right? And of course, the verbal portion is where the bias is supposed to be, right? But of course, blacks actually do better on that. So if anything, that's evidence that IQ tests are biased in favor of blacks a little bit. So the tests are not biased. That's an argument that's not even an argument. It's just a pronouncement that people who don't understand, who haven't read anything about this, make. Okay, so basically we've reasonably ruled out the effect of home environment, of school environment, early educational environment, early nutritional deficiencies, low self-esteem, and test bias. Okay, so I don't know what other possible environmental variables you have. Now, the thing is, you can come up with new environmental arguments all the time, right? You can make up an infinite number of these. But the thing is, evidence points to, and I'm getting really tired, evidence points to genes. Then he says that blacks and Hispanics are poor and have lower IQs, and they get more addicted to drugs because of the stress. And basically he's making kind of like a Malou argument, that they end up getting in kind of a funk. They get poor, the poor causes stress causes the drugs cause more stress, and the drugs cause more poverty, and they all self-reinforce each other. Well, first off, part of this is matter of factly not true. Okay, blacks and Hispanics are actually less stressed than whites, and links into articles that make that case. So in terms of stress, they're actually less stressed. Then this guy is talking about poor people doing dumb things, right? He talks about alcohol and drugs and stuff like that. But he hasn't made any causal argument. Yes, poor people are dipshits. That's why they're poor. Right? The dipshittery causes the poorness. And there is scant evidence that the causation flows the other way. Like, we've looked at the twin studies, right? We've looked at the adoption studies, right? We've looked at all this stuff. Okay? If you look at white European immigrants or North Asian immigrants to the U.S., back when those groups were immigrating to the U.S., okay, as a group, those people weren't dipshits. They were poor at first because they were early immigrants, okay? But they weren't dipshits, and so as a result, they weren't poor for very long, right? That is, the poverty doesn't cause the dipshittery. Like, we have these populations that came in early on that were poor. But just because they were poor didn't mean they engaged in those activities. They did not. You look at Korean immigrants, they don't engage in that kind of behavior, okay? That kind of behavior is not... It's not part of being poor. It's not an inherent part of being poor, right? People who engage in those behavior become poor. That's all. Okay. Then he says blacks do poorly in the school curriculum because the schools don't teach Afrocentric fairy tales about the great sub-Saharan African civilizations. Okay, well, this is irrelevant because as shown previously, blacks have higher intellectual self-esteem than whites. But this guy, Mojosideburns, whatever, he keeps repeating the mantra that you can't prove anything until you level the playing field. Well, my position is that the playing field is level right now, and that the differences in outcomes are almost entirely a result of differences in innate ability, and I believe I made that case reasonably well in this video. Moreover, your evidence that the playing field is not level today is just history and pointing out that poor people engage in dipshit behavior. And, and of course you haven't made any causal connection between historical legal discrimination or legal disadvantages. You haven't made any causal link between that history and today. And given how, trivial the environmental effects are proven when you actually closely scrutinize them, it's unbelievable that prior discrimination would explain much of anything. Finally, just remember that your position, which is the belief that the races are equally innately intelligent, is both an impossible position, it's an impossible thing to exist, and it's a very recent belief. Okay, it's impossible because we have these races, and these races differ in average in every single part of the body, right? Skin, muscles, heart, blood type distribution, adiposity, blood pressure, and brain size and head size. Okay, white European and North Asian women have wider hips than black African women, and that's to accommodate the larger heads of their babies. And in fact, North Asian women are sometimes bow-legged. Right? There's a problem with Asian women being bow-legged because of the very large heads of North Asian babies. Blacks also tend to reach puberty earlier than whites, and whites tend to reach puberty earlier than North Asians. And in general, this is a generalization. So despite all these differences, we are to assume that these races ended up with the same average brain function, right? Despite having different average-sized brains in terms of differences in sizes. Now, I'm not saying here that bigger brains are necessarily better, okay? But bigger brains are different, okay? Why would you assume that these brains ended up with the same average function? Now, this is shown to be an even more stupid belief when we recognize that certainly some individuals are innately more intelligent than others, right? We all know that there are some people who we can tell, and by their performance, it's revealed that they are innately more intelligent, right? Sometimes this innate intelligence does tend to generalize. Okay, now people will specify. Some people will be math whizzes, but people who are like really good at math tend to also be pretty good at spelling or pretty good at writing and English and literature and stuff. Now they do specialize, but there is also a general intelligence factor. And so if individuals can be innately more intelligent than each other, why do we assume that groups of individuals, which we categorize as races, have to be equal on average, when individuals we know are not equal innately? Okay, that's this strange split that people have. The truth is that people simply didn't think this through. Okay, that's why they think this, because they're not really thinking about it. They were told this as gospel as young children before they could evaluate it, which brings me to my next point, that the idea of racial equality is a product of the current historical period. Okay, and the current historical period is characterized by a religious belief in democracy, the unquestioning belief that a state is necessary to have law, and the belief that the races of man are innately equally intelligent on average. And this actually ties in with the Frankfurt School and cultural Marxism. Just a quick explanation. In the 1800s, the German Historical School was the dominant school of economics in Germany, and they held that economic laws were culture-specific. That is, that the classical school of Smith and Ricardo did make accurate predictions and inferences, but that their laws really only applied to the populations that they studied, and that these economic laws were not universal. Right? Marx took this idea of economic relativism and went on to advocate communism. But communism, as we all know, has an obvious incentive problem. Why should any individual work if his work has such a tiny impact on how much he gets paid? Well, Marx believed that man was a blank slate, and so his fundamental nature could be changed through the right conditioning, and man will simply want to work despite not getting any more pay from working hard. And people generally refer to this as the new socialist man that would come from this conditioning, although Marx himself never used the term new socialist man. During World War I, the Marxists believed that the European workers would rally to their classes and rise up against the capitalists and all this bullshit. But as we know, the workers ended up rallying around the nations, their flag and linguistic groups. Only in Russia did communism win out against the czars, but even there, even in Russia, the Bolsheviks actually lost the only elections they held, and I believe the monarchists actually won the first election. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's what happened. Anyway, the Bolsheviks didn't win the first election, and so Lenin ended up just scrapping elections because he didn't want his party to be losing, so he just, dumped democracy when it didn't work for him. And Russia, what a lot of people don't realize, Russia was still highly nationalistic under communism. So much so that Stalin, realizing this, changed the program from an international global workers' revolution to socialism in one country. Right? And that was the idea in order to appeal to the nationalism of the Russians. And even in the USSR, it wasn't really communism. It was just heavy-handed central planning. Right? It's just what we have in the USA to a greater degree. Now, they actually tried true communism in the USSR in the 1920s during the Civil War, and it failed. It failed so bad that Lenin tried to cover it up by calling it war communism and saying that it was only a policy for wartime. But basically, it was communism, and it was a nightmare. And it was a nightmare. And he ended up calling it war communism in order to try to say, well, that's not real communism. That's not what we're going towards. The higher-ups ended up believing that, well, the initial attempt to impose pure communism right away, it failed, obviously, but that's fine because we haven't done the conditioning program yet. So we'll do the conditioning program, and then in, say, 50 to 100 years, we can then try true communism again, and we won't call it war communism when we do it that time. Of course, that ended up not happening. No conditioning worked. Human nature is not that malleable. Anyway, the failure was so glaring, and we're talking about the 1920s here. The failure was so glaring of communism that a group of Marxists decided that they needed to push for a stronger campaign to destroy that fiber of nationalism, tradition, racial identity, and capitalist ethics of like thrift, responsibility, and investment. They had to destroy all of these things, as these were all impediments to people embracing communism, and they believed that this all could be done because they held to the dogmatic religious belief in the blank slate. Okay. So, and the idea of the cultural Marxist is that once the social fiber was destroyed, right, the tradition, racial identity, nationalism, and capitalist ethics, once these are all destroyed and no longer held by anyone, then they could advance communism. And the truth is they've already done so quite a bit. They've completely destroyed racial identity, completely demonized it. They're trying to tie, and now what they're trying to do is people are not that this is not a completely coherent plan. It's not like some puppet master, but it's what people are doing. They're trying to tie racial identity with tradition, right? They've already destroyed racial identity, and so now what they're trying to do is they're trying to link everything on to this point that they've already destroyed. They're trying to link capitalist ethics to racism. They're trying to link traditional values, traditional family values, and social values to racism, and they're trying to link nationalism to racism. So, anyway, now democracy is just a form of communism. Bold claim, you say? Well, not at all. Think about it. The state can, if it really wants to, take away everything that you have, right? There can be a vote to overturn any supposed legal limit you think exists, right? Any constitutional barrier can be voted away. It can, right? Constitution can be amended. All the barriers can be voted away. This means that the state ultimately owns everything in the U.S. There is no private property in the U.S. in the true sense of private property. Okay, the very notion that they can vote to tax part of your property, infers that they already own it and that they can decide on how much to take. And the state is, of course, controlled by the majority, right, in the democratic system. And through the state, the general population owns everything in common, which is to say democracy is communism, which is to say the U.S. is a communist state. Okay, now I know it sounds like a kooky belief, and I know that your instinct is to dismiss this, but if you follow the reasoning, it's very simple and it's very obvious. Anyway, that's where your belief in racial equality comes from. It's not scientific, it's political. Its roots are in Marxism, and it's part of a larger general plan that many people take part in, including you in your very small way. Most unwittingly, most have no idea what they're doing. They just think that they're advocating liberalism, that they're progressives, they're on the cutting edge of societal evolution, or whatever bullshit. But basically, they're pawns for this cultural Marxist scheme. They're idiots, right? And they're basically advancing soft communism worldwide. One last point I would like to make is a more philosophical point, and that is that anyone can choose to have kids, okay? It is not an accomplishment to have kids, and people don't just blip into existence, right? There's no stork that comes from some far-off land that just delivers babies, okay? Let's say one family chooses to have 2 kids, okay? And another family chooses to have 10, okay? That is their choice. Now you may say, well, they were accidents. Well, it is your choice to have sex, okay? We evolved to have sex in order to have kids. When you have sex, you are taking the risk of having a kid. So you have 10 kids, that was your choice. You chose to have sex, and or you chose to have a kid. Okay, now, let's say that the 2 kids from the small family grow up wealthy, and that the 10 kids from the large family grow up to be poor. Right? Is it now the duty of the children of the small family, those 2 kids, to pay to support the children of the large family, those 10 kids? Right? Should they have to pay because those people chose to have more kids than they could support? That's exactly what you're advocating. And that's exactly what anyone is advocating whenever they support welfarism or any of these systematic theft schemes. Okay, I think I'll end that there. I hope you can recognize that you are not at the end of history, okay, that you are in fact living in the age of democracy, and your core beliefs reflect that, and the core beliefs that you hold are not guaranteed truths.